as citing as examples of faith the great figures of the time before Israel entered into the promised land. Now the writer of Hebrews takes two figures from the period of struggle when the children of Israel were winning a place for themselves within Palestine. The first story, as mentioned in verse 30, of the fall of Jericho. And the old story is told in Joshua chapter 6, verses 1 through 20. And the old story is told in this manner. Israel was coming to Jericho, and because the children of Israel, the people of Jericho, because they had heard of how God had blessed Israel to overcome challenges that they faced. And so the citizens of Jericho were fearful of Israel, or fearful of the God who led the children of Israel and gave them victory. So when the citizens of Jericho, the king of Jericho, received word, he shut up the city. None could go out and none could come in. And Jericho was fortified. It had a wall that encircled the entire city of Jericho. And there had been armies or nations, military mights that sought to overcome or conquer Jericho, but failed. The wall around Jericho could not be breached by any military might. But here comes Israel, and God gave Jericho a word or a command that Israel, what other nations or military mights could not accomplish, Israel would accomplish. But God had a strategic plan in terms of how Israel was to engage the city of Jericho and how the wall that encircled Jericho could be breached. And God said to Joshua, I am going to give the city of Jericho to Israel, its king and its men of valor. The army inside the wall of Jericho were an elite military force. Israel was not as such, but they were led by God. And when we understand and allow God to lead and navigate our lives, the impossible can be made possible. And so God, this was the plan that God gave to Joshua. And it was the faith of Jericho and that of the people of Israel who followed the directions or the directives of God to a T. And God said, this is the strategy. They had no military might. They had a ragtag army. They were not elite warriors, among all the nation of Israel. They were sojourners. They were nomads. They were a people without a country to call their own. But God was in the process of bringing Israel into its own country, its own land. And so God said to Joshua, for 6 days, I want the children of Israel to walk around Jericho once for 6 days. The priests shall carry the ark of the covenant. And before the ark, 7 priests are to have trumpets of ram's horns. And there shall be those who go before the priest and those who will follow the ark of the covenant. But God gave instruction that they were to march around the city of Jericho or the wall of Jericho silently. Not one person to make comment or share a word. They were to do it silently. On the 7th day, they were to march around the wall or the city of Jericho 7 times. 7 times. And in the manner in which I have just expressed, they were to walk around silently, with the ark of God and the priests, etc., priests carrying the trumpet of ram's horns, etc. But on the 7th time around, when completed, Joshua was to give the priests the command to blow the trumpets. And the people were to shout with a great shout. And God had spoken to Joshua, saying to him, when the priest blows the trumpets, and when the people give a great shout, the walls of Jericho shall fall. Yes. And Joshua and the children of Israel did exactly as God had spoken. 6 days, once a day. On the 7th day, 7 times around. And the Bible tells us in the old story that Joshua gave the command for the priest to blow the trumpet of the rams, and the people to shout with a great shout. No arrow was flown, no artillery at all. It was just a great shout, a great shout. And God said, when you do it, the wall of Jericho shall fall. Other nations had tried with military might. But here comes the people of God under the directive of God of heaven and earth, and to do exactly as God had instructed. And when they did it, sure enough, what military might could not do, what human power could not do, when they shouted, the people of God shouted, the wall of Jericho fell. And God gave Israel command. After the wall has fallen, you march in and destroy the city. Keep the silver and gold, and honor me with the silver and gold. That which is accursed, you are not to have anything to do with it. But there was one command, one directive that God gave to the children of Israel. There was a woman who lived on the wall of Jericho. Her name was Rahab. Rahab. The Bible refers to her as a prostitute or a harlot. God gave Israel the command, do not harm her. Do not harm her. Because Rahab she believed in the God of Israel. She believed in the God of Israel. So her life would be spared. Her life would be spared. And what we are to learn here, my dear friends, the writer of the Hebrews wishes to make known to us the taking of Jericho. The taking of Jericho was the result of an act of faith. An act of faith. It was taken by men who thought not of what they could do, but of what God could do for them. God accomplished. They believed. They had faith in what God had instructed them to do. They believed. And because of their faith in the sovereign God, what seemed to have been impossible became possible. God did it. God did it. My friends, when we are faced with any great and demanding task, or when we are faced with great challenges or circumstances in our lives, God is the ally. We must never leave out of our circumstances or the challenges of our lives. God is our ally. God is our friend. And God must be a part of. And we shall never leave God out of the challenges that we face in life. The things which we find it impossible to accomplish alone are always possible with God. With God, all things are possible. All things are possible. So the story of Jericho, the old story of Jericho, is and the lesson we are to learn and live by and apply to our lives is to have God at the forefront and know that God is our ally. God is our friend. And we are never to leave God behind or out of our reckoning or out of the challenges in which we face in life. The things, as I have said, the things which we find it impossible to accomplish alone, we always are always possible with God. Always possible with God. Now, the second story of the two verses I have cited, the writer to the Hebrews is that of Rahab. And the story is told in Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 through 21. And the old story is told like this. Joshua called two men to go and spy out the country. That is also Jericho. Spy it out. See how strong it is, etc. And when they entered into Jericho, the two spies that had been sent by Jericho, they found lodging in the house of Rahab, the prostitute. I find that amazing. God works in mysterious ways and his wonders to perform. She did not deny them lodging in her house. Matter of fact, it was Rahab who protected the two spies that had been sent by Joshua to spy out the land. There was one person who had come of the knowledge that there were spies in the city of Jericho. And that person went and spoke to the king of Jericho. There are men here who are here to spy out our city. And so the king of Jericho sent men to hunt and capture the spies. Rahab became aware of the king's command to capture them and to put the spies to death. Matter of fact, they came to Rahab, a prostitute, as scripture tells us. And before those men who had been sent by the king of Jericho to capture the two spies, she had placed them on the roof of her house and covered them with flax. And so the men came and questioned Rahab. And somehow Rahab did not reveal where they were. To make a long story short, after those men had left, Rahab went up on the roof of her house and talked to the two spies. And this is essentially what she said. Listen carefully. For I know the God in which you serve. I know the God who have called you to come to Jericho. I know, listen to her, I know God has given, your God has given Jericho into your hands, the children of Israel. I am aware, listen to her, that God brought you through the Red Sea. God spared your life. And when you crossed the Red Sea, the Ammonites came upon you, and God gave you victory. Sihon and Og came up against you. And although you were weak, God gave you victory. And I know God has placed Jericho into your hands. Here's a woman who believed in the God of Israel. And she said to those two spies, when you come, when Israel comes, and God has given this city into your hands as a nation, I have one request of you, that my life will be spared. My father's life, my mother's life, my sisters, my brothers, all that we have will be spared. And the spies responded by saying this: if you do not reveal where we are, keep silent, just keep silent, then God will spare your life and the life of your family. And Rahab said to the spies, now it's time to leave. And she lowered the two spies on a rope down the wall of Jericho at night and told them to go up in a mountain and stay there for 3 days and 3 nights. She kept the secret. She kept the secret. And Israel honors Rahab, the prostitute, because she kept the secret and because she was a woman of faith who believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, she was the one who believed that God had led God's children across the Red Sea and had given them victory. She put her faith and her confidence in that God, and God spared her life. Yes. And isn't it amazing that the one who is called a prostitute in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, you find Rahab in the genealogy of Jesus the Christ. And Israel honored her because of her faith in God. The story is quite amazing. And the writer of Hebrews cites her as an example. And the point he wants to make is this: Rahab, in the face of all the facts, believed in the God of Israel. And as I have noted, she said to the spies whom she welcomed, and here I know that the Lord has given you the land. Your God has given Jericho into your hand. The Lord, your God, is indeed God in heaven above and on earth below. That is what she spoke to the spies at the moment when she was speaking. There seemed not one chance in a million that the children of Israel could capture Jericho. These nomads, Israel, from the desert, had no artillery, little military might. They had no tanks or anything of that nature. Yet Rahab believed and staked her whole future on the belief that God would make the impossible possible. I say again, she placed staked her whole future on the belief that God would make the impossible possible. Listen to me carefully. When common sense pronounced the situation hopeless, common sense, she had the uncommon sense to see beyond the situation. When we walk in uncommon sense and not try to figure things out on our own using our common sense, but walk in uncommon sense, which we rely on the faith that we place in God. The uncommon sense, that ability to see beyond the situation, to see beyond the situation. That's what faith is really all about. To see beyond. The real faith and the real courage of those which can take God's side when it seems doomed to defeat. Take God's side, even when matters seem hopeless and doomed to defeat. With God on the side of those who walk in by faith are those who walk in victory. The hymn writer F.W. Faber put it this way, and I quote, "Thrice blessed is he whom is given the instinct that can tell that God is on the field when he is most invisible. For right is right, since God is God, and right the day must win. To doubt would be disloyalty, to falter would be sin. Christians believe, we are called to believe, that no one who takes the side of God can ever ultimately be on the losing side. If we take the side of God, then we are on the winning side. The walls of Jericho were breached by Israel when no other mightier nation who had tried failed. But it was God who led Israel. And it was Israel who put their faith in the instruction of God, believed the directive that God had given to Joshua. They believed it. And they did, again, I tell you, exactly what God had instructed them to do. And upon marching around the city 7 times and blowing the trumpet and with a great shout, they saw what was impossible, what had been tried before, became possible. The walls came tumbling down. They fell, and they walked across and took the city. Oh, you might say this is an old story, that God can't do that anymore. I tell you, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It's not about God at all. It's about will we put our faith and our trust in that God who is sovereign. That's the challenge. And if we are willing today to take up that challenge, to make the decision today to put our faith, our trust, our confidence in God, we will see God do that which is impossible in our lives, that which common sense cannot really figure out, that uncommon sense of that we must walk in, and by putting our faith in our God, or to have the faith of a child and to be humble before God, God will certainly do that which we feel is impossible. For even if we experience earth's defeats, there is a victory whose trophies are in heaven. So the choice is ours to make, to put our faith in God, and to allow God to navigate our lives and the situations of our lives, just as Israel in this pericope, in this passage of scripture, verses 30 and 31. Jericho fell. Rahab's life was saved, as well as her family's, because of faith. Both stories are about faith in God. And I say again, God is the same God hasn't changed. God hasn't diminished in power. His love is still as strong today as it was yesterday. Nothing has changed with God. So may we trust God with all that we are and with all the situations and challenges we face today as well as tomorrow. The peace of God be with you. Amen.
Amen.